This story is about the architect's key. There was once a man named Edward, who designed and built his own perfect house. He lived in it for many years until he eventually passed away. A new family moved in, but whenever they went into the basement where Edward's personal study had been, they would get the feeling that someone was watching them. One day, the father of the new family decided to fix up an old jacket, which every tailor in town had told him was beyond repair. So he went down to the old study, laid his jacket on a chair and then tried to see if there was anything in the old desk that could help him mend it. But the drawers were all locked, and he couldn't find a key anywhere. The next morning, he came back down to find the key on the desk, all the drawers open and his jacket completely fixed. This story is about a mother's love. Some people actively go out looking for ghost encounters, and every once in a while, they find one. When Kevin was a teenager, he and his friends had heard about a dangerous turn on the nearby highway that caused many accidents over the years. It was now haunted. The most well-known story was of a mother who took her own life after her son had crashed his car and died there. It was said around town that her ghost remained at the deadly turn to protect people from ending up like her deceased child. Kevin and his friends decided to put that theory to the test. At night, Kevin drove his friends out to the highway. When the group of boys arrived at the turn, they pulled over. They'd brought a bag of flour with them and proceeded to sprinkle the white powder on the road, the grass, and the car. The idea was to get footprints to prove that the ghost was indeed real. The boys hopped back in and began to take the car around the turn. Kevin accelerated faster and faster and thump. The car came to an abrupt halt as if someone had slammed down on it with their own two hands. They immediately got out of the car and saw two woman-sized handprints in the white flour on the hood. This story is about the ghost in the hall. 4 young women moved into an old New England apartment together. You know, the type with squeaky floorboards and a long, dark hallway. A month after they moved in, one of the roommates realized that her favorite stuffed teddy bear was missing. The others all said they hadn't touched it or seen it. Weeks went by, and she almost forgot about her teddy when something strange happened. She opened the door to one of the closets they hardly ever used, and there on the top shelf sat her furry friend. All her roommates swore they had no idea how it had happened. Now, whenever the teddy bear goes missing for a few days, she knows exactly where to find it. Their apartment probably had all these other signs of being haunted too. This story is about a voice in the desert. 2 young men in their 20s, Josh and Dan, went on a camping trip together in a desert in New Mexico. They didn't take much with them besides sleeping bags, food, and materials for a fire. After they cooked their dinner, they fell asleep as they gazed up into the starry night sky. The beauty and peace of the trip were short-lived, however. In the early hours of the morning, Josh was startled awake by what sounded like Dan's voice, but frantic. The voice said, "Come here, quick. Look." Sleepy and confused, Josh got up to see what his friend was talking about. He heard again, "Come here, quick. Look." It sounded unnatural, a perfect repetition. Josh took a few steps forward, and then someone grabbed him from behind. He turned around to see Dan with his finger in front of his mouth, warning Josh to keep quiet. They rolled up their sleeping bags and left. They still don't know who or what was trying to lure Josh away into the desert. This story is about echoes of the past. A young bachelor at the beginning of his career became very successful very quickly, so he bought himself a house. One morning, he awoke to the sound of running water. He rushed to the bathroom and saw that the bathtub faucet was running on full blast. He was perturbed by this, as he lived alone. A week later, it happened again, only this time it wasn't just one faucet, it was all the faucets in the house. The young man called a repairman to fix the pipes and the water damage, but, as it turned out, the pipes weren't broken. The repairman, a local, seemed visibly shaken. "What's wrong?" the bachelor asked. "The woman who lived here before you," said the repairman, "she drowned in that bathtub." The ghosts of drowned victims linger in these haunted bodies of water. This story is about no steals twice. Jen went to the same convenience store every day after school for a snack. Over time, she became good friends with the cashier, Lucy. Out of curiosity, one day Jen asked Lucy how she would stop someone if they tried to steal from the store. Lucy replied, "Oh, no one ever steals anything from here twice. The store won't let them." Jen didn't know what that meant but dropped the subject. When she went back to the store at the start of the next school week, Jen walked in to find Lucy talking to some cops. Apparently, a man stole from the store and drove off, but his brakes mysteriously failed and his car went soaring off a cliff. The cops asked Lucy if she knew what happened. "No," she said. "I was stalking the back room. I didn't even know he'd come in. No one ever steals twice." This story is about when the candle burns. 3 little girls were having a sleepover one night when they decided to try to hold a séance. One of the girls, Clara, recently lost her grandpa and wanted to see if she could commune with his spirit. The 3 girls gathered some candles and a few items that belonged to the late grandfather, his watch, his cigar case and a photograph of him. The girls held hands and started the séance. Suddenly, the candles began to flicker, and the hands on the watch began to spin. Clara was sure it was her grandpa. Elated, she began to talk to him and ask him questions, when all of a sudden one of the candles flew, as if by some invisible force, and almost hit her head. "Grandpa would never do that," she said, shaking. She was right. It wasn't her grandpa, and whomever it was clearly did not like being disturbed. That's why you should always be careful when summoning spirits or using a Ouija board. This story is about the curse of the eldest son. India's parents came to the United States from Pakistan. Before they were married, India's father was engaged to someone else. It was an arranged marriage, and the prospect made him unhappy, so he broke it off. The woman went off the deep end. There were rumors in the town that she had started using black magic. She even ran right up to him in the street one day, screaming that she had put a curse on his eldest son so that he would die before he reached manhood. In fact, India's older brother, the eldest son, died in a car crash on his 18th birthday. This story is about the uninvited party guest. One night, a group of adults was having a dinner party. There were 6 of them, and they had all just taken their seats when they heard an unexpected knock at the door. The woman hosting the dinner party opened the door to see who it could possibly be, but no one was there. "Somebody must have realized they had the wrong address," she explained to her guests. But when they all turned their attention back to the table, there was a 7th plate set. "Was that there before?" one of the men asked. I must have set an extra place by mistake," said the hostess. She took it back to the kitchen, but when she returned, another plate was there, this time with a glass next to it. The other guests had been talking among themselves and hadn't seen anything strange. But when they realized what had happened, they were shocked and didn't know what to do. At this point, they figured the best strategy was to play along, so they filled the empty glass and plate, so as not to upset their mysterious uninvited guest. This story is about after hours. It was 9 o'clock, time for the store to close. Valerie, Ginny, and Kelly were the only ones working. As they were cleaning up the store, a pile of shirts fell to the floor. None of the girls had touched them. "It's probably the ghost," Ginny said. "Very funny," said Kelly. "No, really," Valerie replied. "He's a little boy. He likes to play." Kelly still didn't take them seriously, though. She thought they were teasing her because she was younger. But when she went into the back room to get her keys to go home, she saw a flash of a young boy in the mirror next to her. When she looked back, her keys had been placed on the floor. This story is about the lonely Ferris wheel. The carnival came to town every summer, and this year was no different. But Charlie had just started working there, so he didn't know what the rest of the workers knew about the Ferris wheel he was in charge of operating. The first night of the carnival was bustling with people, but as it came time to close, it was practically a ghost town. However, there was one boy who showed up at the last minute. "One for the Ferris wheel, please," the boy said, giving Charlie a ticket. Charlie looked around. "Where are your parents?" he asked the little boy. The boy just took his seat and didn't answer. Unsure of what to do, he let the boy go on the ride. But when the ride was over, the boy was no longer in his seat. Charlie ran to his boss to tell him the story. The boss casually said, "Oh, that's Thomas." He handed Charlie a clipping from an old newspaper. It had the boy's picture and the headline, "Boy falls from Ferris wheel, 8 years old." This story is about the laundry thief. A woman and her daughter moved into a new house. The mother worked a lot, so it was up to the girl to do the household chores, including the laundry. One day, the girl went down to the laundry room and put in a load of clothes. When she came back, the door to the washing machine had already been lifted open. "That's weird," she said to herself. "I thought I closed it." She shrugged it off, but the next time she did laundry, it happened again. And that's not all. Each time it happened, one piece of her clothing would go missing. One time it was a sock, the next a pair of shorts, and so on. After a few weeks, she went down to the laundry room again to find a complete outfit set out for her, with all the clothes that had been missing. This story is about the child in room 213. An executive went on a business trip for her company. When she arrived at the hotel, she got the key card for her room, 213, and went straight up. She was exhausted and couldn't wait to sit down, but her keycard didn't work. She went down to complain to the front desk and promptly got a new card. That one didn't work either. Just as she was storming off to go back to the lobby, the door to her room creaked open. A little boy had opened the door, and he was standing in the dark. She went to the front desk again. "There's another family in my room," she said to the man. "No, that's impossible," he said. "No one has checked in but you." This story is about the traveling photograph. After Anna's dog, Bo, passed away, she started carrying his photo with her everywhere. She loved Bo more than anything, which is why she was so heartbroken when she lost the picture. Anna lived in a big city and was sure she'd never find it. But when Bo's birthday came around the next year, she found the photograph in the closet next to his old leash. "Good dog, Bo," she whispered. This story is about shattered glass. Sam, Peter, and John met up every day after work for a drink. This time, they decided to try some place they had never been before. "They say this place is haunted," Peter told his friends of the bar they'd chosen that night. The other two insisted that was nonsense, and they all sat down in a booth. When their drinks arrived, they were about to make their usual toast when both Sam and John's glasses completely shattered. "What gives?" they yelled. "Apologies," said the waiter. "That happens sometimes." This story is about the daughter's scarf. One freezing January night, a man was driving down a deserted road. The snow was picking up and quickly turning into a blizzard. But this man was not the only one on the road, there was another man driving behind him. The other man flickered his car lights to signal him to stop, and both men got out of their cars. The second man stretched out his hand and gave the first man a pink scarf. It was soft and looked just like his daughter's. The man who gave him the scarf had a terrible look in his eyes and a terrible smile to match. Frantic, the father jumped back into his car and sped home, where he found the police already waiting for him. This story is about wedding in the dark. An engaged couple planned to have their wedding reception at their absolute favorite restaurant. But on the day of the wedding, the bride tragically fell down the stairs and died. Now, it's said that every night after the restaurant closes, the ghost of the bride walks down the very stairs she fell from and sets up all the tables and chairs for the wedding guests she never got to see. This story is about Three's a Crowd. Two sisters were at home while their parents were out at an event one evening. They stayed up late, talking and telling stories in the older sister's room. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by the sound of loud music. They looked at each other, confused and unsure of where the music could be coming from. The older sister got out of bed and began walking down the hallway. It sounded like the music was coming from their parents' room. She peered into the dark room, saw her father's laptop open screen on, music blaring. And right then, the music stopped. Scared, the girl ran back to her room, where her younger sister was waiting on the bed. Frightened, she shut the bedroom door behind her and got back under the covers, holding her little sister tight. They heard slow, heavy footsteps, one after another, heading toward their end of the hall. When the footsteps stopped, boom, boom, boom. 3 hard knocks on the bedroom door. No one came in, but they certainly didn't try to leave the room for the rest of the night. This story is about a psychic warning. Not all spooky stories are scary sometimes, they're just otherworldly. Frank was at the mall one day by himself when, in the middle of walking from one store to the next, an older woman ran up to him gasping for breath. "I ran all the way from the other end of the mall to find you because I sensed you were here," she said. Frank had no idea who this woman was, and he was understandably frightened. He tried to push her away. Then she said, "I have to tell you, your brother's death was not your fault." Frank was stunned. He had never met her before in his life, but she somehow knew that his brother had died and that he felt guilty. Frank's brother had been a drug addict. He called Frank the day he died, but Frank didn't pick up the phone. "Your brother doesn't blame you," she said with compassion. Satisfied that she had fulfilled her duty, she walked away and disappeared back into the crowd of shoppers. Frank broke down in tears. This story is about when art imitates life a little too closely. There was a house in a small neighborhood in Maryland that went overboard with Halloween decorations every year. Whenever the crisp, fall air rolled in, the entire town would look forward to the unveiling of the new display. But no one ever really talked to the person who did the actual decorating. He was a loner. People only knew him for his Halloween spirit, and his decorations became grander and more lifelike every year. The newest one was a Vlad the Impaler theme, hyper-realistic. Bloodied mannequins were pierced through with wooden stakes and left to the crows in a gruesome display. It was the ultimate work of horror, so much so that it caused quite the controversy in the town. While some loved it, many of the local parents wanted it taken down for their children's sake, so a town official made the trip to the house soon after the unveiling to discuss the matter with the man who lived there. She knocked on the front door. No answer. Knock, knock. Nothing. She rang the doorbell. Nothing still. It was then that the official realized there was a putrid smell in the yard and an unusual amount of bugs buzzing around for this time of year. She wandered over to one of the mannequins to get a closer look at the incredible craftsmanship. The smell got worse. She gagged and had to put her hand over her mouth. Her eyes went wide. The official put her trembling finger up to the doll, and felt the soft, smooth, cold touch of human skin. After that, no one was able to locate the man who'd once lived there. Now, it is truly a haunted house. This story is about the cat that ate your brain. The translucent egg-shaped shuttle glided silently to the curb. A bright light flashed my face, causing my vision to blur, and a second later a woman's gentle voice said, "Welcome aboard, Andrew." The interior of the shuttle was sparse but inviting. I sat on the grey leather bench and pulled out my phone. There were several bottles of water next to a box of Kind bars and some succulents. Smooth jazz oozed from hidden speakers. But the shuttle stayed stationary, and my phone was dead, a black rectangular void. The company's shuttles were essentially rolling Faraday cages, no wireless service allowed. They had to be for what came next. The mood lighting suddenly shifted to a spastic, woozy display of neon pinks, blues, and greens as an advertisement for the latest energy drink consumed the shuttle's interior. All trips via the company's shuttles this month were subsidized by the energy drink. That's why they were so cheap. Next month would be underwritten by a dandruff shampoo. The month after that, the U.S. Army. The ad was way louder than it needed to be. The flashing, staccato lights were starting to make my eyes burn. I remember a time when you could skip after 5 seconds. I remember being able to opt out. Eventually, the shuttle began to drive. It knew where I was going because it had all my metadata, including my search history. Over the course of the trip, I was bombarded with targeted ad after targeted ad. The shuttle's AR windshield became a tapestry of wish fulfillment, images of my face on a more sculpted body in an ad for a bar class, an image of me with a beautiful woman purring about a dating app. Did I know there was available real estate in this neighborhood that was within my price range? My phone was still bricked. I tried shutting my eyes, but infrared sensors picked up on that and the shuttle slowed to a crawl. These ads were mandatory viewing. Opening my eyes again, I was startled by the sudden appearance of a hologram of my mother on the armrest. "Don't forget to buy life insurance, darling," she wailed, her face frozen in anguish. The shuttle was using a funeral home photo plucked from my cloud as a reference for the hologram. I could tell because she'd never in her life worn that candy apple pink blush the mortician applied. The algorithm was primed to look for an old photo, but of course, the funeral home photo counted as old, all these years later. I flinched as her tiny, translucent hand reached for mine. Was I dreaming, or was it getting colder? 15 minutes saves you 15%, she moaned. My dead mother stayed with me until the end of the ride, imploring me to buy life insurance, Yankee candles, and a new air freshener called Avocado Breeze. Finally, the ride concluded, and she morphed back to her reference photo before vanishing. I felt cold and wanted to step into the sun, but the shuttle door remained closed and locked, trapping me inside. 3 more ads in exchange for my freedom. The techno music began to peak, building and building and building. They were cramming in as many images as possible. It became an unreadable blur, but the tempo kept ascending. I felt dizzy, nauseous, near death. In despair, I waited for the beat to drop. Finally, I implored it to, screaming at the flashing screens, begging for relief. But it never came. This story is about the 5th roommate. 4 of us young women were sharing a spacious 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building. None of us had met each other before, but an online hunt for accommodation in a metro city brought us together. It had been a month, everything was good and we were still getting to know each other and the city. On a particular Sunday night, we all went to bed around 12:30 am, after a night out. Our room had 2 queen-size cots. In between the 2 cots were a small coffee table and a chair. At around 2:30 am in the morning, I was abruptly awoken. I barely opened my eyes to see one of my roommates sitting on the chair with her hands on the coffee table. I was not really alarmed and casually asked her why she was up at this hour. I dozed back off to sleep before I could even hear the answer. The next morning, everybody was rushing to work since it was a Monday. I returned back home after a long day, at around 9 p.m. One of my flatmates was watching TV and the other 2 were still not home. After talking about our day, she surprisingly asked me who was awake last night and kept turning the lights of the living room on and off. Given my experience of the previous night, I said it must be Ishu as I saw her sitting awake in the middle of the night. Almost half an hour after the 2 of us had this conversation, the other 2 flatmates also reached home. While we were all eating dinner, Ishu looked at me and asked me why I am always awake in the middle of the night and advised me to keep a bottle of water next to my bed. Shocked, I asked her to stop bluffing because I never wake up until I have snoozed my alarm a minimum of 3 times. I told her, "You are the one who was wide awake last night. You even disturbed the other 2 by fidgeting with the living room's light." Following this, I had the most creepy conversation of my life. Isha revealed that she has seen me sitting on the chair at the middle of the night multiple times, including last night. When she woke up and saw me like this, she asked what I was doing and I apparently told her that I woke up to get water. After hearing my answer, she fell asleep. We also learned that the other 2 roommates also got disturbed by the lights at around the same time. One of them even noticed the presence of someone passing by in the dark. But that isn't even the worst part. Isha claimed to have seen me at least twice in the same position at the same time. This was the first time I noticed her sitting on the chair. After a little investigation, we learned from the neighbors that the house had remained unoccupied for over a year, after the previous tenant passed away followed a miscarriage. That piece of information was enough for us to believe that there was a fifth flatmate. Least to say, we all vacated the place in less than a week. This story is about the sinister fourth floor. When I was living in a hostel during my 9th and 10th grade. There were 4 floors in our hostel and we were only 25 or 27 girls. The 4th floor remained empty, with only maids visiting once a month to clean up. Previously, there had been an occasion where one very quiet and simple girl had tried to commit suicide from the 4th floor. But owing to stress, we didn't make much of it. Back then, I had the habit of waking up at around 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. and study until breakfast. My roommate, on the other hand, would stay up till 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. and wake me up before she goes to bed. On one such night, my roommate woke me up and I saw that she had gone completely pale and her eyes were a bloodshot red. I asked her what was wrong and she said nothing and slept off. I thought she must have had a fight with her boyfriend and went to study. But all that time that I was studying, I kept feeling that somebody was watching me. It made me so afraid that I closed my books and went off to sleep. The next morning, I asked her what was wrong and she curtly said, "Nothing, I got to go." After that, she kept ignoring me and when I finally confronted her, she told me the creepiest story I have ever heard. She told me that she was studying as per usual at around 12:30-ish. The timing is creepy because the previous suicide also took place the same day. She decided to make coffee for herself and on her way back to the room, she felt like somebody was following her. She turned around and saw me. She noticed I wasn't wearing my spectacles, or flip-flops or the small black thread my mother tied around my hand. She didn't make much of it but asked me, "You're up earlier than usual," and I responded with, "Let's go to the 4th floor's balcony." She asked me why I wanted to do that and I said it would be really fun and that I grabbed her by her hand and took her upstairs. Once we got there, she made a few comments about the weather and then I responded saying a simple word, "Jump." She, obviously scared and worried, couldn't believe what I was saying. And I kept insisting, "Jump, jump, jump." She claimed that I got pretty aggressive at which point she went inside and came back to the dorm only to find me fast asleep. Her bloodshot eyes then made a lot more sense to me. This story is about an accidental meeting. This incident dates back to January 2011. I was studying for my MBA then and one evening I got a call that my younger brother had met with an accident. Luckily, the hospital was just 10 minutes away from my college so I rushed to go see him. My family members were all waiting outside the ICU and told me that his condition was pretty serious. A little while later, we were informed that he was out of danger. But after that, we started hearing him scream in agony like he was in a lot of pain. While my parents were talking to the doctors about this, I sneaked into his room. As soon as I entered, he stopped screaming. He said, "Isn't it your birthday today? Happy birthday." This surprised me but even then I went and sat beside him. Then I asked him about how his accident occurred and he seemed to have no answer as to how he fell off his bike. In the middle of this, he gets off his bed and starts limping towards the window. Imagine, a man who was screaming in pain, with bandages all over his body, getting up and walking. I asked him what he was doing and says, "Watch me." My younger brother was about to jump out of the 6th floor window of the hospital. Luckily, I ran towards him and tried to stop him. When I was able to take control, I yelled out to my parents and everybody pulled him in. By now, his face wasn't looking normal and neither was he behaving in a normal manner. Later that day, he started chanting that if he stays in the hospital any longer, he will be dead. My mom decided to take action and take him home. He came home and napped, but when he woke up, he began behaving weirdly again. He was peeping through the windows in tears and he told my mom, She has come to get me. He then jumped out of the sofa and ran into the puja room and kept peeping outside. I gathered my courage and asked her who she was talking about. And he pointed towards the swing set outside and said, "She wants to take me." I couldn't see anyone out there. After some time, he calmed down but not for too long. A little later, he stood on his toes in front of an opened cupboard and started laughing very loudly. When we probed him over and over about this, he said that it was her who was laughing and not him. That night, I was awakened from my sleep by the feeling of someone tying up my toes. After a lot of deliberation, I opened my eyes to see what was going on and realized I was sleeping next to a woman who wasn't my mother. I screeched so loud that everybody at my place woke up. My parents dismissed it as my imagination and we then began looking for my younger brother. We found him on the terrace talking to himself. When my mother asked him, he said, "I have to go tomorrow with her, so I was just talking about it." Following this, he began addressing himself as Aparna. My mother had had enough by this point and called the local priest. He told us that my brother had saw something of himself from the place he had his accident. We later learned that a girl who was just about to get married, died at the same spot of his accident. In the end, we had to take my younger brother to an ashram in Gujarat, where he took months to become normal once again. This story is about the old lady and her pets. I have lived in the Banasthali University premises during my childhood as my parents were working there. And in this time period I have encountered quite a few paranormal activities. But this is the scariest one by far. I was in 4th standard. There was a huge, dense forest behind my house and we kids weren't allowed to go there. But one evening, we decided to explore the unexplored without telling our parents. We knew that there were wolves in the first. But being kids, we thought of ourselves as superheroes with superpowers. Even as it was getting dark, we stayed there. It was a little adventure for us. But by now, I started getting negative vibes and started trying to convince everyone to go back. Suddenly, we heard the growl of the wolves. We were so scared, we couldn't move. From the back, we heard a woman say that this area wasn't for us, it was hers and her pets lived here. We turned around and saw an old lady with a terrible accident mark on her cheek. She wasn't wearing a black sari and had a bag in her hand. She asked us to leave and never return. We were terrified at this point and one of my friends even started crying. The old lady then gave us a handful of chocolates and asked us to leave again, before the wolves come out. We agreed, but then she insisted we have the chocolates before we leave. I didn't have any but a couple of the other kids did. She looked angry about and as we started to leave, she stopped 3 of us and said, "Don't sleep today." One of my friends innocently asked her why. She gave us a very evil smile and said that if we do our worst fears will come true. After hearing that, we bolted from there. After that, we went to our usual hangout place and started talking about the incident and then went home. We forgot about the lady and I slept off as I had a test the next day. That night, I dreamt that I was going away from my parents in a car, as if I am never going to come back. I saw my mom crying and hugging me, while my father looked as if he will cry too. My mom wore her green suit and red dupatta, while my father was wearing a tracksuit. As I sat in the back seat of the car, I looked back to wave for the last time my parents, but instead I saw none other than that old lady, giving me that same vicious smile and waving. 3 months later, this nightmare came true. My parents decided to send me to my grandparents' home in Mathura after my 4th class annual exams, for further study. That day my mom was wearing the same thing, and so was my dad. I was livid. After sitting in the back seat, when I looked back for the last time, I saw that woman instead of my parents. The same evil eyes, the same vicious smile, and the same waving. A while later, I got to know that Arkit's mother passed away. When I returned to my hometown many years later, I inquired about what had happened. He revealed to me that he saw his mother dying in his dream that night. His fear was losing his mother and mine was, getting separated from my family. The third boy Deepak didn't sleep that night, so nothing went wrong for him. It could be a coincidence, but I can't shake it off that all of this was that evil woman's doing. Even now, I see glimpses of her in my nightmares, and when I do, those come true. This story is about the Burning Man. Back in 1991, when I was 5 or 6 years old, my father got a new job in a district called Faizabad. We were given a 2-bedroom flat in the factory housing complex. This house was old and had remained locked for the past 5 years. But since we were a bit hard-pressed for money, my dad had insisted that this locked flat should be allotted to us instead of waiting for another to be vacated in a year or so. Once we moved in here, things started to go seriously wrong. Initially, small things started to happen. Like every other night, we would hear footsteps or feel like somebody was jumping over the backyard wall and then heading to the roof. There was also a huge, strange burn mark on the bathroom wall. No matter how many times we painted over it, somehow it would peel off and the mark would become visible again. Once, my dad had to go on an urgent trip to a nearby town, and it was just my mom, my sister, and me staying back. In the night, my mother shouted and ran to our bedroom and switched on all the lights. She was sweating and mumbling something. Both of us kids got scared. My mom somehow took control of the situation, opened the main door and called the security guard. From what I overheard, my mother had sensed a half-man burnt standing next to her bed and quietly staring at her. The security guard, who was scared too, agreed to go around the house and look, but he couldn't find anything. This episode was then brushed aside. After this, the number of strange occurrences increased in our house. Like the taps would randomly turn on and the lights would flicker even when we weren't touching the switches. But the most horrifying incident happened on a cold night in December. I remember sleeping in my room with my sister, on a bed covered with a mosquito net. A bulb was lit in the bathroom, so there was plenty of light to look around. In the middle of the night, I woke up feeling very restless. I felt like something was moving under the bed. I looked at my sister and she was fast asleep. And then, I saw something that knocked the life out of me. A burnt arm was extending from under the bed and caressing my head. The hand had only 3 thick fingers, and as it moved, the mosquito net was also moving with it. I couldn't move. From the corner of my eye, I could just see the burnt hand moving. I was frozen. After a few seconds or a few minutes, the hand went away and I covered myself in my blanket and broke down. The entire night I felt something crawling under the bed and making a weird hissing noise. After this incident, we moved out of the house and into the company guest house. We later got to know the previous tenant of the house was a chemical engineer, who lived there with his family. Once, while he was on a business trip, he had an accident and died. While his dead body was en route to the same house in the complex, his father locked himself in the bathroom and immolated himself. The burnt mark was from the same incident. 2 bodies were cremated that day. One of that engineer and the other one of this father who committed suicide. That was 5 years before my father joined the company, and the house had remained locked all this time. After hearing the story of that guy, I could make the connection. Maybe that hand was of his burnt father, who might still be looking for his son. May they both rest in peace. This story is about the funeral home. My family home used to be a funeral home. It's over 100 years old and I'm pretty certain it's haunted. I used to have sleep paralysis sometimes when I would come home on breaks from college, where I would wake up unable to move but could see a pale figure of a girl with a dark headband standing next to my bed. She was always facing the window, so I never saw her face, but man, it was terrifying. My dog would also sleep in my bed and wake up in the middle of the night to bark at a dark corner in my room and stuff like that. After I had sleep paralysis, I spent the rest of that Christmas break sleeping in my mom's bed with her. Becca. This story is about the ghost Marvin. My family had a ghost named Marvin. When I was away at college, my dad moved into a new house and he and my sister immediately declared it was haunted. I remember my sister texting me throughout the semester, wide awake at 4 a.m., because she was freaked out. She and my dad named him Marvin as a joke, but it kind of stuck. Marvin was actually pretty polite. He would turn off the lights when we left them on. I remember my dad and sister Skyping me, explaining the weird things that would happen. They would be watching a movie and Marvin would turn off the hallway lights and bathroom lights if they were left on. Sometimes he'd turn them back on, though, doing this multiple times throughout the movie or show. These lights weren't on a timer and they were the kind you had to push hard to turn off. My family decided it wasn't an electrical circuit malfunction because every time Marvin would turn off the lights you would hear the click as if someone has pushed the switch down. Once, while I was home alone one day during the summer, I was pulling my hair into a ponytail in front of the front door mirror. Suddenly I heard a man's voice say clearly in my ear, "Hello." I whipped around and no one was there. I was really freaked out, so I went for a run just to be out of the house and waited until my dad got home from lunch. We eventually moved and said goodbye to Marvin. I'm pretty sure he's still there. This story is about the haunted middle school. My middle school was haunted by the ghost of Violet Sharp, a suspect in the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. She was proved innocent after she hung herself in the maids' quarters. My school was the converted Morrow estate. Charles Lindbergh married Anne Morrow in my math/drama classroom. But the third floor, the old maids' quarters, was the most haunted place in the school. You never wanted to be roaming around after hours in any of the school. Doors would open and close, lights would flicker. But there were offices on the third floor, and when you went up there down this one hallway, you would feel yourself suffocating, not 100%, but you felt it. Everyone has the same experience. And one time I was trespassing on another part of the campus with a group of friends one night, and we heard a choir of children there. 100% was no choir there. This story is about the spooky summer getaway. When I was younger, my two siblings and I would spend summer weekends away at my cousin's house. Their house was in this region that was pretty isolated and full of farmlands. I remember one day, when I was maybe 8 or 9, it was particularly hot. Their house didn't have AC. While the temperatures cooled down at night, it was still uncomfortable. I was sleeping in my older cousin's room with my little sister and I woke up in the middle of the night because it was too stuffy. I decided to go sleep out in the living room because I had remembered that my aunt opened the windows and sliding glass door, so there was at least a breeze and circulation. I don't know how long I was asleep, but I remember waking up what seemed like seconds later. Before I opened my eyes, I had a feeling that someone was watching me. I was facing the couch, and when I finally opened my eyes, I saw a little girl sitting across from me. She wore a dress that looked like it was from the 1890s and was brushing her long, wavy hair. She was a bit transparent but had a gold tint because of the street light that was shining in on her. I blinked and she put down her brush in her lap, smiled at me, did a little wave, and mouthed hello. I immediately shut my eyes, shot up, and ran back to my cousin's room. I remember only being able to fall asleep because I convinced myself that it didn't happen. When it was morning, I was the last to wake up. I walked into the kitchen where everyone was already eating breakfast. My older brother was in the middle of telling a story. Apparently he had woken up in the middle of the night, too. He had also gone to the living room and was woken up by the feeling that someone else was there too. He saw the same little girl and ran away just like I had. I freaked out and told him about my identical experience. This story is about the rural home's dark secret. I grew up in a very old home in rural Wisconsin. It was over 100 years old when we moved in, and the original structure was added onto throughout the years before we moved in. It was originally a one-room house. When I was little, my brother Dylan and I would always see and hear weird things. As an adult, we remember them vividly, but when we were kids, we'd brush it off, and our parents would say we were imagining things. One time, Dylan went up to our mom's room to grab something for her and turned around to see a little boy standing in the doorway of our shared room. The right side was always particularly creepy and it was a renovated attic. And when I was a kid, in that same room I would see my Barbies moving on the top of my flat dollhouse. My mom had friends stay over one night, and one stayed on our couch. He woke up in the middle of the night to someone choking him and was like, there's something here and I need to leave, and bolted. The real clincher is that when I was in high school, we had to get a new septic tank, and my parents couldn't find it anywhere because the records were awful, so they ended up getting a hold of the son of the original owners. He was 1,000,000 years old, and he told my parents where the tank was because he helped dig it out. My mom was like, I have to ask, we've had some creepy stuff happen here, but whatever it is, it seems to like our family. She asked if the place was haunted, and according to my mom, when she asked him, his face turned white and blank. It was because his brother hung himself as a teenager in our living room. This story is about Victoria's Black Swan Inn in San Antonio, Texas. The full story of Victoria's Black Swan Inn is featured in an episode of House Beautiful's podcast, Dark House. Subscribe here. Victoria's Black Swan Inn is a lush, 35-acre home and wedding venue cloaked by 100-year-old oak trees in San Antonio, Texas. While it's a romantic scene ideal for nuptials, it's also allegedly infested by the spirits of those who've lived and died on the property. Built in the mid to late 1800s on a plot of land where, 50 years earlier, 60 Mexican soldiers were killed in the Battle of Salado, the Greek Revival Manor has had a plethora of owners, many of whom were prominent San Antonio socialites and are also said to still be lingering there in the afterlife. Once operated as a dairy farm, the barn behind the primary residence is the most haunted building on the property. Many of the earlier occupants, including members of the Ripstein and Mahler families, spent their lives there. Later occupants included sisters Catherine Holbrook and Blanche Woods, Catherine's husband, who died at the home, and Blanche's children and grandchildren. Almost all of them are said to haunt the estate. The current owner, Joanne Rivera, lives in the stunning home with her family, and while it isn't actually a functional inn, she does partner with local ghost tour companies and has invited paranormal investigators in over the years. Some theorize that perhaps the paranormal activity is being caused by a particularly menacing anchor item, a porcelain doll. Rivera is an avid collector. Tune into Dark House to hear the full details and countless tales of unsettling specters. This story is about Soden House in Los Angeles, California. The full story of the Soden House is featured in an episode of House Beautiful's podcast, Dark House. Subscribe here. This Mayan revival home designed by Frank Lloyd Wright Jr., the son of the legendary architect Frank Lloyd Wright, towers over Franklin Avenue at the bottom of the Los Feliz foothills. While its unique architectural character is certainly noteworthy, arguably the most interesting thing about the home isn't necessarily the block-style facade, which was inspired by the menacing yet beguiling opening of a cave or an ancient tomb. After it was built in 1926 for photographer John Soden and his young family, the house enjoyed years of hosting bohemian parties for Hollywood's in crowd. But when Dr. George Hodel moved into the house in 1945, its fate as the potential crime scene of America's most notorious cold case, the Black Dahlia, was sealed. Though the murder of Elizabeth Short remains unsolved to this day, by 1950, Dr. George Hodel became one of the prime suspects in her tragic case, and many true crime buffs are convinced that he carried out the crime right inside this iconic Los Feliz mansion. The home also went through a few stages of abandonment in the late 20th century, making it even more mysterious and spooky to passers-by. According to Steve Hodel, former occupant, retired LAPD investigator, and son of Dr. Hodel, several onlookers have noted its haunting trappings. According to Steve, in the 1970s, the Hodel housekeeper returned to the Soden house and informed the then current owner this is a house of evil, and on another occasion, Edmund Teska pointed to the house saying, "It's an evil place." Artists, philosophers, accountants, and politicians all played and paid there. Murders happened there. It's an evil place. During the same era, Dr. Hodel's daughter Tamar went inside the home and claimed to see the spirit of a young woman in the basement. Years later, in 2016, Ghost Adventures host Zach Bagans investigated the Soden house with Tamar's daughter Fauna, who claimed to see the exact same spirit her mother did. This story is about the Villisca Axe Murder House in Villisca, Iowa. The full story of the Villisca Axe murder house is featured in an episode of House Beautiful's Haunted House podcast, Dark House. Subscribe here. On June 10, 1912, Josiah and Sarah Moore were horrifyingly killed inside their home in Villisca, Iowa. Their 4 children and 2 friends who were spending the night were also murdered, and to this day, the crime remains unsolved. Their home is considered one of the most haunted houses in the country, and guests have been drawn to visit it for years. People pay $400 plus to stay for one night. Tours have been cut short by children's voices, falling lamps, moving ladders, and flying objects, says the Villisca Axe Murder House website. And, in 2014, a paranormal investigator stabbed himself after spending the night. Skeptics have left believers, adds the website. As of October 2023, U.S. Ghost Adventures, known for its entertaining and historic overnight stays in allegedly haunted locations across the country, is under contract to buy the infamous historic Villisca Axe Murder House in Villisca, Iowa. This story is about Ammon's house in Gary, Indiana. The full story of the Ammon's house will be featured in an episode of House Beautiful's podcast, Dark House, in October 2023. Subscribe here. In 2011, LaToya Ammons moved into a small single-story home in Gary, Indiana, with her mother and her 3 young children. Only a few short months later, after reportedly experiencing the worst residential demon infestation since the Amityville Horror, Ammons brought her family to the emergency room in an attempt to help free them of demonic possession. After extensive evaluations by police, members of the local church, hospital staff, and the Department of Child Protective Services, the witnesses were torn. Half of them believed the house was infested by spirits and demons, and that the family was genuinely possessed by something paranormal, while the other half blamed psychological issues. Just like the best-selling book about the Amityville house turned into a national sensation, this modern instance of demonic possession went viral. The good news is that the Ammons family was able to find peace when they moved to Indianapolis, but the story, and the house itself, were still getting tons of attention. Ghost Adventure host and paranormal investigator Zach Bagans bought the property from Ammons' landlord in 2014 to shoot pseudo-documentary footage inside. Even though Bagans proceeded to tear it down, the Ammons house is about to get even more press. Oscar nominee Lee Daniels is directing a film based on the story, The Deliverance. It's set to stream on Netflix in 2024 and will feature Stranger Things star, Caleb McLaughlin. This story is about Chop Chop House in Boise, Idaho. The house at 805 West Linden Street in Boise, Idaho is hard to miss. Covered in a layer of soot, with windows broken and boarded up and trash strewn about the yard, the 2-story, 2,728 square foot craftsman-style home looks like an abandoned horror movie set. The true story, however, is much scarier. Locals refer to it as the Boise Murder House, or even more eyebrow-raising, the Chop Chop House, which is a glib reference to the gruesome homicide that took place there more than 3 decades ago. According to many who've lived in the neighborhood or even rented out a room in the house itself, the basement, in particular, exudes some haunted energy. There have been reports of shadowy figures appearing and disappearing out of nowhere, strange liquid oozing down the walls, and more. The full story of the Boise Murder House is featured, along with a guest interview with Justin Long, in an episode of House Beautiful's Haunted House podcast, Dark House. Subscribe here. This story is about Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California. The full story of the Winchester Mystery House is featured in an episode of House Beautiful's podcast, Dark House. Subscribe here. In 1886, an eccentric widow left her home in Connecticut for California's rural Santa Clara Valley to start a new life after the tragic loss of several family members. She wasn't the average widow, she was Sarah Winchester, the millionaire heiress whose fortune was derived from the gun that won the West, an increasingly controversial truth. Once in the Bay Area during the height of spiritualism and well before the 19th Amendment, Winchester managed her own finances and acted on a passion for architecture and design by overseeing the never-ending construction project of a rambling mansion in San Jose. She named the rambling property Lanata Villa, which she interpreted as House on Flat Land, but today, it's better known as the Winchester Mystery House. Her reclusive lifestyle along with the restrictive gender norms of the era and the blood money she was associated with, caused neighbors and the local press to speculate, and legends quickly began to swirl about the mysterious woman and her bewildering house. Though it was a modern marvel at the time with indoor plumbing, multiple elevators, a hot shower, and central heating, the mansion was appraised as having no value due to doors that opened to nothing but thin air, staircases that lead straight into the ceiling, and its maze of labyrinthine hallways. Legends began swirling, speculating that Winchester's bizarre architectural choices were an attempt to rid the home of unwelcome spirits of the dead killed by the Winchester rifle, but defenders swear she didn't have a superstitious bone in her body. Regardless, it's possible that Winchester herself still haunts the halls of the house-turned-museum today. This story is about Amityville Horror House in Amityville, New York. The full story of the Amityville Horror House will be featured in an episode of House Beautiful's podcast, Dark House, in October 2023. Subscribe here. This Dutch colonial sitting pretty on Ocean Avenue in Long Island, New York is perhaps the country's, and world's, most famous real haunted house, though whether or not it was all a hoax is up for debate. But haunted or not, the Amityville home has certainly witnessed plenty of horrors. On November 13, 1974, Louise and Ronald DeFeo Sr. and 4 of their children were killed inside the home. Their eldest son, Ronald DeFeo Jr., went unharmed and he was ultimately charged with the murders. A year after the brutal murders, the Lutz family moved into the house, which still housed much of the original furniture and decor from its previous tenants. Then, just 28 days after moving in with their 3 young children, the Lutzes fled the house in a panic. Not long after, they worked with author Jay Anson on the best-selling book-turned-hit movie, The Amityville Horror, which tells the dramatic, and controversial, tale of the demonic and unseen forces that drove them out. The Lutzes' story is widely regarded as fabrication, but plenty of people still vehemently believe it's haunted, and that it was haunted even before the DeFeo family lived and died. This story is about the Lemp Mansion in St. Louis, Missouri. The full story of the Lemp Mansion is featured in an episode of House Beautiful's Haunted House podcast, Dark House. Subscribe here. Starting strong with a very scary house, the Lemp Mansion in St. Louis, which is known to be one of the most haunted places in America due to its tragic history and links to a wealthy beer baron. Adam Johann Lemp, a German immigrant, was the first person to produce and sell lager-style beer in the U.S. He stored the barrels in an underground cave system beneath the city to keep them cool pre-modern refrigeration. It was successful, but his son, William Lemp, is the one who really brought it to the next level. In the 1860s, William Lemp wanted to live closer to the industrial plant and start a family with his wife Julia, so they built the foreboding home in the historic Benton Park neighborhood right over the cave system. We smell a haunting. Everything seemed to take a turn for the worse in the new millennium, and William Lemp died by suicide in 1904 after his favorite of 5 sons, Frederick, died tragically due to complications of tuberculosis. A few years later, his wife also died of cancer in the house. In 1920, the youngest daughter, Elsa Lemp, mysteriously died in her home, not the Lemp Mansion. Then, in 1922, after running the company for years and seeing it flounder during the Prohibition era, William Lemp Jr. shot himself in the same room William Sr. died in. One of William Jr.'s brothers, Charles Lemp, lived in the home from the 1930s until 1949 when he shot his own dog in the basement of the home before dying by suicide in his room. That same year, the youngest surviving Lemp child, Edwin, sold the house and transformed it into a boarding house, where reports of hauntings began. According to Destination America, witnesses have experienced burning sensations, slamming doors, disembodied moaning and crying, amongst other things. Today, the Lemp Mansion is a restaurant and in that also holds events, including weddings, murder mystery dinners, and even ghost hunting experiences. This story is about Kasha House of Kaimuki in Honolulu, Hawaii. The full story of the Kasha House of Kaimuki with exclusive stories from locals and a former resident is featured in an episode of House Beautiful's Haunted House podcast, Dark House. Subscribe here. The Kasha House of Kaimuki in Honolulu, Hawaii has been shrouded in mystery for decades. Its first bad press mention hit the Honolulu Star just months after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. According to the article, police responded to a call from a woman shouting, "She's trying to kill my children. She's trying to kill my children." When they arrived, they found a young Hawaiian boy, his 3 sisters, and his mother all shrieking and being tossed around by nothing. About 30 years later, other occupants of the same home, or one a block away from the original spooky house, reported similar attacks by an unseen force, which the responding officers corroborated. The 2 most common theories surrounding the source of these reported attacks are a demonic shape-shifting creature of Japanese folkloric origins known as the Kasha, and the angry spirit of a corpse buried in the backyard. Though it has since been torn down and replaced by condos, the dark energy still lingers, according to locals and residents. This story is about 1000 Lombard Street in San Francisco, California. The full story of 1000 Lombard Street is featured in Indiana 2 episodes of House Beautiful's Haunted House podcast, Dark House. Subscribe here. Socialite, journalist, and famed party host Patricia Montandon moved into an apartment on San Francisco's famous Crooked Block, Lombard Street, in 1960. She lived happily in her Russian Hill abode for 8 years, until things began to go awry following an astrology-themed party she hosted in the apartment. In her memoir The Intruders, Montandon attributes a series of hauntings that culminated in a corporal tragedy to the bizarre behavior of a disgruntled tarot card reader who may have cursed the apartment the night of that fateful party. From eerie laughter and faint music seemingly coming from within the apartment on repeat, to constant rushes of cold winds despite locked doors and windows, and strange disembodied footsteps, the paranormal events were stacking up quickly. But Montandon was also the victim of physical crimes following the party, including a robbery, harassment, possibly arson, and more. After a tragic fire at the apartment and the premature passing of 3 of her close friends, all of whom had separately lived in the apartment between 1968 and 1969, Montandon set off on her own investigation to uncover the root of the apparent curse on 1000 Lombard Street. This story is about Ackley House in Nyack, New York. The full story of the Ackley House is featured in an episode of House Beautiful's Haunted House podcast, Dark House. Subscribe here. Nicknamed Ackley House after its one-time occupants, the Ackley family, this classic Queen Anne sits on the Hudson River across from Sleepy Hollow, New York. The many ghosts who roamed the halls of one La Veda place were nothing but friendly, though they were active enough to inspire the matriarch, Helen Ackley, to write a national article about them in Reader's Digest. The article gained enough momentum that the house became a stop on local ghost tours, which ended up having some not-so-great ramifications when it came time to sell the home in the late 1980s. The Ackleys found themselves entangled in a legal battle over whether or not they should have disclosed the haunted nature of the house to the Stombosvka family. In a landmark legal decision now referred to as the Ghostbusters ruling, Ackley House was deemed haunted by the New York Supreme Court, and the buyers were able to pull out of the sale while also getting half of their down payment back. One La Veda place has since been home to several celebrities, including musician Ingrid Michaelson. This story is about Grey Gardens in East Hampton, New York. The full story of Grey Gardens is featured in 2 episodes of House Beautiful's Haunted House podcast, Dark House. Subscribe here. The Grand East Hampton estate known as Grey Gardens has a fascinating history with many ups and downs. The 4 acres of land the home now sits on is in the Georgica Beach section of East Hampton, one of the most expensive regions in the world, and it was purchased by a wealthy couple in 1895 before the home was built in the early 1900s. By 1913, it was sold to the president of a coal company whose wife, Anna Gilman Hill, imported ornate concrete walls from Spain to enclose the garden. The house was called Grey Gardens because of the color of the dunes, the cement garden walls, and the sea mist. Later, in 1923, the home was sold to Edith Bouvier Bale, the parental aunt of Jackie Onassis Kennedy and Lee Radziwill and her family. After a series of misfortunes and financial losses, the home fell into disrepair and was overrun by cats and raccoons, and perhaps something else not of this realm, partially because Big Edie Bale and her daughter, Little Edie Bale, couldn't afford to maintain the mansion on their own. The women's story, and star power, was made famous in a 1975 documentary by Albert and David Maysles. Big Edie held onto the property until her death in 1977, and her spirit is said to remain at Grey Gardens, watching over the house. Among the believers is author and journalist Sally Quinn, best known for her column in the Washington Post, who purchased the home from Little Edie in 1979, and she swears that it's haunted. Savannah, Georgia, USA. March 5, 2009. Historic Mercer Williams House as seen from one of the public squares designed in 1860. This Italianate revival that inspired Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil played host to 3 Untimely. This story is about Mercer Williams House in Savannah, Georgia. The full story of the Mercer Williams House is featured in an episode of House Beautiful's Haunted House podcast, Dark House. Listen to it here. Located across from one of Savannah, Georgia's most famous and pristine squares, Monterey Square in the city's historic district, the Mercer Williams House dates back to 1860. In the 1970s, famed preservationist and antiques dealer Jim Williams restored the home to its former glory after years of neglect. This Italianate revival played host to 3 untimely deaths, including that of 11-year-old Tommy Downs when he fell off the roof in 1969, the 1981 fatal shooting of Danny Hansford by Williams, and Williams himself, when he died in the same room as Hansford less than a year after being acquitted of Hansford's death in a 4th trial. If the story sounds familiar, it's probably because you recognize it from the best-selling book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Much like the rest of the city, the home was supposedly built right on top of unmarked graves. Rumors about the crime and ensuing ghost stories continue to swirl to this day. This story is about Jean Harlow House in Los Angeles, California. The full story of the Harlow burn house is featured in an episode of House Beautiful's Haunted House podcast, Dark House. Listen to it here. Los Angeles is one of the best destinations for haunted house hunting, and this Bavarian-style home in Beverly Hills has a particularly gruesome history. In 1932, it was home to the iconic actress Jean Harlow and her abusive husband, Paul Byrne, who shot himself in the head while standing in front of the mirror. Their butler discovered him and called MGM instead of the police, so there were tons of rumors that it wasn't actually suicide. Many suspected Byrne's ex-girlfriend, a suspicion exacerbated by her jumping off a boat to her death a couple of days later. Jean moved out after his death but died only a few years later at the age of 26. But wait, it gets creepier. In 1963, celebrity hairstylist Jay Sebring bought the home and lived there with his girlfriend, Sharon Tate, until she left him for Roman Polanski. They were still friends and remained so until both of them were murdered by the Charles Manson cult. Tate was the same age as Harlow when she passed. But back to when the couple lived in the Harlow house. Tate told several friends of creepy occurrences in the home and even mentioned it in interviews. For example, once, when she was sleeping in the master bedroom alone, she saw a creepy little man. Her friends say she believed it to be Paul Byrne's ghost. She was so freaked out when she saw the alleged ghost that she ran out of the room and then saw a hanging shadowy corpse with its throat slit in the hallway. There are also stories about 2 other people dying in the swimming pool over the years. This story is about S.K. Pierce Mansion in Gardner, Massachusetts. The full story of the S.K. Pierce Mansion is featured in an episode of House Beautiful's Haunted House podcast, Dark House. Listen to it here. Massachusetts has no shortage of haunted mansions, it seems, and the S.K. Pierce Victorian is one of the state's eeriest. The original occupant, Sylvester Pierce, had just started making his fortune in the furniture business when he built this home for himself, his son, and his wife, Susan. As a man about town, he hosted many notable people in his 7,000 square foot home throughout the years, including President Calvin Coolidge, Bette Davis, and Norman Rockwell. Only a week after moving into the home, Susan fell ill and passed away from a mysterious bacterial disease. A year later, he remarried Ellen, a woman 30 years his junior, and had 2 more children. Years later, when both Sylvester and Ellen had passed away, his sons embarked on a fiery feud about the property as well as the furniture company, but the Great Depression swept in and made their choice easier since the company basically went bankrupt. The youngest son, Edward, was given control of the home when he turned it into a boarding house. It became a hot spot for illicit activities, including the murders and sudden, tragic deaths of several occupants, according to local lore. As a result of these violent ends, guests have reported every kind of haunting imaginable, from visions of apparitions to flying objects, disembodied sounds, pressure, temperature drops, and more. This story is about Mudhouse Mansion in Fairfield, Ohio. Located in Fairfield County, Ohio, until recently, the Mudhouse Mansion has a bad reputation. Nobody can seem to agree on when it was built, but it dates back sometime between the 1840s and 1900. Unlike the other abandoned mansions on this list, you sadly can no longer visit it, as the home was demolished in 2015 after not being occupied since the 1930s. The last resident, at least legally speaking, was Lulu Hartman Mast, and the current owner of the property is her relative Jean Mast. Because there's so little information about who lived here and when, and because abandoned places tend to ignite the dark side of the imagination, there are tons of legends around alleged atrocities occurring, and consequent hauntings. The sources don't seem to be very credible, though. This story is about 455A Sackett Street in Brooklyn, New York. You never hear as much about haunted apartments as haunted houses, which is strange considering that apartments have much more turnover, and therefore a higher likelihood of something, or someone, evil having lived there before you move in. That was definitely the case with 455A Sackett Street in Brooklyn. One woman who grew up there writes about her first-hand experiences, including unexplained fires, seriously bad energy, family tragedies, personal suffering, and, here's the kicker, the body of a child discovered in the wall after several suspicious sightings of a similar-looking shadow child in the mirror. You can read her full account here, as well as commenters who also lived there and corroborate these claims. I'll definitely not be requesting an in-person viewing for this place private balcony or not if this address ever pops back up in my StreetEasy feed. This story is about Hotel Monte Vista in Flagstaff, Arizona. The Hotel Monte Vista has numerous paranormal guests they can't get rid of. The hotel, which opened as the Community Hotel in 1927 named after the townspeople who helped raise the funds for its construction, has a history of underground opium dens, speakeasies, and gambling. Today, the hotel is known for the paranormal activity that haunts some of the rooms and halls. Guests who've stayed in room 220 have experienced the TV changing channels on its own accord, and some have said they felt cold hands touching them in their sleep. There's also reportedly a phantom bellboy who knocks on doors and announces room service, but when guests get to the door, no one's there. One of the more popular and possibly most disturbing encounters is the sound of an infant crying in the basement. The hotel website reads, "Staff have found themselves running upstairs to escape the sound of the cries. Though the sounds are very real to those who hear them, there has been no information that has explained the phenomenon." This story is about 19. Myrtle's Plantation in St. Francisville, Louisiana. Rumored to be on top of a burial ground is the Myrtle's Plantation in Louisiana, which is the home to at least 12 different ghosts. Built in 1796, ghost stories center around the tale of an enslaved woman named Chloe, who had her ear chopped off after she was reportedly caught eavesdropping. Seeking revenge, Chloe killed 2 of the master's daughters by poisoning a birthday cake. She was then hanged by her fellow enslaved people, and today is reportedly seen wandering the plantation with a turban on to conceal her ear. This story is about Hotel Cecil in Los Angeles, California. More cursed than haunted, downtown L.A.'s Hotel Cecil got such a bad rap that it actually changed its name to stay on Main. If you're a true crime and paranormal super fan, you've likely already heard of it. Where to begin? So many bad things have happened here, there's literally an entire Wikipedia page dedicated to its violent history. The first recorded death by suicide is in 1931, followed by a long string of similar deaths in 1932, 1934, 1937, 1938, 1939, and 1940. At some point in the 30s, one man was pinned to the exterior wall by a truck. A woman murdered her newborn in the building in 1944, and the pattern of suicides continued into the 60s. In 1962, a woman jumped from the 9th floor window and landed on a pedestrian, killing them both. It's worth noting that two of the women who died by suicide apparently jumped while their husbands were asleep in the room. In 1964, Tenant Goldie Osgood was brutally murdered, a crime which has remained unsolved. Next, in the 80s, the infamous serial killer Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, stayed at the hotel, and in the 1990s, Austrian serial killer Jack Unterweger lived there. Other weird things kept happening, but the weirdest is definitely the disappearance and death of 21-year-old traveler Elisa Lam. A few weeks after Lam went missing, her body was discovered in the rooftop water tank after visitors and tenants complained about a funky taste. They later found odd footage of her in the elevator from the night of her disappearance. It's difficult to make out what she's doing. It looks like she's either playing hide and seek with someone outside the elevator, or she's frightened and attempting to hide from someone, but the doors won't seem to shut. Authorities ruled the death accidental drowning, but because you need a key to access the roof, many suspect foul play. This story is about the Lee family mansion in Taiwan. Built in 1929 in Baroque style, the Mingxian Ghost House, aka the Lee family mansion, is a place with a heartbreaking history. Located in the Taiwanese countryside, it's been abandoned since the 1950s when the family fled abruptly. Like all mysterious places, there's plenty of lore around the family and why they left the once beautiful place. Local legend says the maid was having an affair with her employer, Lu Rongyu, and when the secret came out, she jumped down the well to her death, but since she did not live to tell the tale, who's to say another family member didn't push her? Then she came back to haunt the family until they finally left. A few years later, it was occupied by members of the Kuomintang of China, KMT, many of whom were also thought to have died of suicide, which exacerbated its reputation as haunted. People who visit report plenty of ghostly sightings. This story is about Los Feliz murder mansion in Los Angeles, California. During the mid-20th century, this large Los Feliz home was the, seemingly, happy home of Dr. Harold Perelson and his family, until the horrific night of December 6, 1959, when he murdered his wife in her sleep with a ball-peen hammer and attempted to murder his 3 children before drinking acid to kill himself. Fortunately, his eldest daughter let out a scream when he struck her in the head, waking up the younger children, who then walked into the hallway to find out what was going on. During the commotion, they were all able to flee. Before the murder-suicide, he was a successful doctor who invented a new type of syringe after investing most of his money into its research and production. Still, he got screwed out of the rights, leading investigators to blame financial problems. Other creepy details include a passage from Dante's Divine Comedy left open on his bedside table. 2 years later, it was sold to the Enriquez family, who used it as a storage unit, and their son continued to do so until he sold it to a couple in 2016 who had plans to fix it up. But it seems to have scared them off because, within a few years, it's on the market again. Photographers also report a feeling of needing to run away from the house when they get close up to it. This story is about Villa de Vecchi in Italy. Villa de Vecchi is foreboding, all right. Just consider that looming fog blanket. Located near Lake Como, Italy, the House of Witches dates back to 1854 to 1857, when it was built as a summer house for Count Felix de Vecchi. The family was only able to spend a few years there, as their lives were mired in tragedy right after it was built. First, the architect died a year after construction. Then in 1862, Count de Vecchi came home to discover his wife murdered and his daughter missing. When he could not find her after a year of searching, he died by suicide. His brother then moved into the home and his family continued to live there until World War II. It's been vacant since the 1960s, and an avalanche in 2002 wiped out all the houses in the area, except this one. Spooky. This story is about the Crescent Hotel in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. In 1937, millionaire inventor Norman G. Baker posed as a doctor and turned the hotel into a hospital that he said could cure cancer. Have the chills yet? Baker, who had a fetish for purple, painted many sections of the hospital in the color, and today, the chimneys remain that same color. In addition to wearing purple shirts and ties, he drove a purple car as well. People came from all over with hopes of curing their cancer, and many who were treated died. Eventually, Baker was exposed and run out of town, and today the property is an active hotel. It's said to be haunted by several ghosts, including a bearded man wearing Victorian clothing and a 5-year-old girl.